evil is a force that when you see it, you will never forget it. But Americans don't see evil like Israel saw on the 7th. When you do polls of young Americans asking if they'd fight for their country, or the figures are terrible, but they have no concept of ever needing to do that. They have no threat from Canada, yet. And it's the same in Europe. Most of Western Europe, less now in Eastern Europe since the Ukraine war. But the idea of what you're actually dealing with Hamas is just a different world than the world that somebody buying their morning frappuccino in a Starbucks can imagine. And this is one of the things that has startled me in the last 11 months, is one thing in particular has haunted me. Many things have, but one thing I can't get out of my head is the sheer lack of empathy. The sheer lack of empathy for the Israeli people.
Watch Douglas Murray torch TikTok warriors and campus activists who debate pronouns while 18-year-old IDF soldiers clear booby-trapped tunnels. Western youth flinch at Wi-Fi outages while their Israeli peers face death cults head-on. Spoiler alert, your anxiety about Wi-Fi outages isn't quite the same as surviving actual terrorism. Ready for the most savage takedown of keyboard revolutionaries ever filmed.
They imagine that Israel is a white supremacist society, which I always say is one of the ways to show you've never been to Israel. And they believe that Israel, because they believe that America is based on genocide, they accuse Israel of genocide. It's a very clear pattern at this stage. There is no other reason for them to level these extreme allegations that are so flagrantly untrue.
So the passion you see on the American left in condemning Israel and launching these calumnies against it has increased in the last 20 or 30 years because of the passion on the American left for this intersectional worldview that they've grafted on to Israel and the Middle East.
Oh, absolutely, because, I mean, and in the early, one of my best friends made a huge influence on me, was a friend called George Weidenfeld, who was born in Vienna in 1919, fled the Nazis in 1938, came to London, was Chaim Weizmann's secretary at the foundation of the State of Israel, and he died 10 or so years ago. It was my great pleasure to have him as a dear friend. I used to ask George often, he was a man of the left himself, when it changed. And he said, Douglas, it was 67 and then 73. He said the left loved Israel in the main until Israel was winning. And now, gosh, this is even more true. If you look at the world and you believe everything is about underdog and overdog, who has the power, and you create this new power structure in which Israel is not the David but the Goliath, you can accuse Israel of anything, and that's what they're doing.
How much of it, both here and in Great Britain, is it the fact that a generation of left-wing politicians in the Democratic Party and the Labour Party viewed Israel as their natural ally? Labour governed Israel for its first 30 years, and then what they viewed as this alien party, the Likud party, took over about 50 years ago, 47 years ago, I guess to be exact, and it's largely been center-right government since then. And today you often hear the government of Israel condemned as the most right-wing government in Israeli history. But if you look at demographics and voting trends in Israel, it might also be the most left-wing government in Israel's future as well.
Yes.
So how much of that do you think plays a role in our countries?
I think there is almost no understanding outside of Israel about Israeli politics. I think that almost everyone is completely ignorant. They cannot understand it. One of the things I've been trying to tell people in the last year, I've spent most of the last year in Israel since the 7th, and been living rather curiously with the residents of a town from the north who've been displaced. By the way, everyone talks about Palestinian refugees and nobody talks about the tens of thousands of Israeli refugees. But one of the things that I've been trying to say to the media and wherever I can is, you all think that the problem is Benjamin Netanyahu. And almost everybody in the Western press thinks this. I always say, you have no idea of the fact that, and I can say this having met and interviewed almost every opposition leader, every potential replacement for him. Every single Israeli politician of left, center, and right would have prosecuted a war against Hamas after the 7th if they'd been in power. It is just not the case.
The Western left's view of Israel is what happens when TikTok activists with gender studies degrees try teaching Middle East politics. While 180,000 Israelis are displaced refugees, campus warriors who can't find Gaza on a map scream colonialism from their $75,000 per year safe spaces. Fun fact, Israel was the left's darling until 1967. Turns out they only love underdogs until they survive. Guess self-defense is problematic when you're supposed to stay perpetually oppressed.
It's a sort of Netanyahu problem, but that's always what they obsess with. People say to me sometimes, what if Benjamin Netanyahu was replaced by somebody else? Wouldn't it buy Israel more time? I say, oh yeah, sure, about 24 hours. And before you know it, they would accuse the most left-wing leader in Israel of being a far-right extremist for daring to protect the Israeli nation.
Well, we saw that in display last year. When President Herzog spoke to the joint session of Congress last year, numerous Democrats boycotted him as well. And whatever you think of President Herzog, there's no question that his family is a distinguished political family of the center-left in Israel. And when you're boycotting not just Prime Minister Netanyahu, but President Herzog as well, your problem is not Benjamin Netanyahu, your problem is Israel. And that's the problem that so many Democrats in Congress have today. Speaking of Prime Minister Netanyahu, we've heard in this country there was Bush derangement syndrome first, and now there's Trump derangement syndrome. It does seem that not just here, but in Israel as well, there may be a degree of Bibi derangement syndrome. I have to say it was remarkable to me to see after Hamas executed in cold blood 6 hostages last weekend, executing them because Israeli troops were closing in on them, that the reaction you saw across so much of at least large cities in Israel were protests in the streets against the prime minister. You had the Histadrut shutting down the nation in a general strike before it was ordered to stop by court. So many people speaking out against Prime Minister Netanyahu as if he was the one who had executed these hostages, or he was the one who was holding them hostage himself. What do you think accounts for that on the Israeli left?
Well, this is something which I find profoundly disturbing. I have done for many months. There are people inside Israel and out who behave as if the hostages are in Benjamin Netanyahu's basement. It's quite appalling. And after the murders last week, the world media and politicians behaved as if Benjamin Netanyahu had killed them. I think one of the only explanations for this is we in the West are so far away from reality today. We are so far away from understanding the reality of evil. Hannah Arendt used this famous, awful phrase, the banality of evil, and she was completely wrong. Evil is a force that when you see it, you will never forget it. But Americans don't see evil like Israel saw on the 7th. When you do polls of young Americans asking if they'd fight for their country, or the figures are terrible, but they have no concept of ever needing to do that. They have no threat from Canada yet. And it's the same in Europe. Most of Western Europe, less now in Eastern Europe since the Ukraine war. But the idea of what you're actually dealing with Hamas is just a different world than the world that somebody buying their morning frappuccino in a Starbucks can imagine. And this is one of the things that has startled me in the last 11 months. is one thing in particular has haunted me. Many things have, but one thing I can't get out of my head is the sheer lack of empathy. The sheer lack of empathy for the Israeli people.
While TikTok warriors sip $7 lattes and debate pronouns, they can't comprehend actual evil because their biggest trauma is Wi-Fi outages. A whopping 94% of Gen Z Americans say they wouldn't fight for their country. Easy position when your biggest threat is your phone battery dying. These keyboard revolutionaries lecture Israel about peace from their gated communities, while confusing their anxiety about midterms with surviving actual terrorism.
I think so often of the survivors of the Nova Party who I've spent a lot of time with, and I wonder so often why do their contemporaries in America, who would love to, who'd go to a dance, rave, or whatever, why don't they all think, God, that could have been me? Why, when the survivors of the Nova Festival come to New York, do they have to face down people in the streets outside hating them? Israelis are the only people in the world who, when they're attacked, then get attacked again. And the sheer lack of empathy for the situation Israel is in is just startling to me. And it's unforgivable for the people who've indulged in it. Remember, we've had in recent years, believe all women. And it turns out that doesn't apply if the women who are raped are Jewish. And we had the world, when I covered the conflict in northern Nigeria some years ago, when the northern Nigerians, Chibok schoolgirls, 300 of them were stolen from their village in northern Nigeria. Michelle Obama and every influencer on Instagram held up the rather futile, but still nice, hashtag bring back our girls. Where were these people when the girls were Jewish? And the sheer lack of empathy for the situation they're in just startles me.
A lot of what we've been discussing, a lot of what we heard this week, and frankly, the news from Israel has been solemn and saddening. So why don't we end on what I think will be a more uplifting and inspiring note. As you mentioned, you've spent much of the last year in Israel, and much of that time with the young men and women of the Israeli Defense Forces. So could you just share a little bit of firsthand testimony about what you saw from those troops and what lessons we might draw from them?
I got to Israel as soon as I could after the 7th, and I went straight to the massacre sites and felt it was important to sort of bear witness to what had happened, because I feared that it was going to be covered over very fast. Everyone would talk about Israel's response, the retaliation, the revenge, as they like to say. And I spent a lot of time with the families of the hostages, of survivors in the hospitals and elsewhere. Went to the morgues of Tel Aviv when the pathologists were doing their terrible work. But there are two things that really, really stick with me, and I hope always will stick with me. The first, of course, is the horror of the day and of what people were put through. And nobody who's seen them or spoken with them can ever forget the victims. But the second thing is the heroism that was on display on the 7th from individuals. We've heard from some of the people from United Hatzalah, but people who just drove south and helped and fought. And then, most importantly, the young men and women of the IDF. I've been in Gaza with them and seen them in their careful, incredibly dangerous work. Where if they open a tunnel shaft, the booby-trapped, somebody, when those 3 poor young men were shot who were hostages earlier this year.
Funny how Believe All Women stops at Israel's border, and Instagram warriors who posted black squares for every cause suddenly lose their hashtag fingers when Jewish victims need support. While 18-year-old IDF soldiers clear booby-trapped tunnels, Western college kids scream oppression from their safe spaces. The same activists who'd live-streamed their trauma over cold coffee watched Nova Festival survivors get harassed in NYC and said nothing. Guess empathy needs a PR team these days.
Every time a group of people come out of a building with a white flag in Gaza with their hands in the air, almost every time somebody will come through the middle with a Kalashnikov to fire at the Israelis. This is really difficult terrain. But the men and women of the IDF, they've answered a question which everybody has on their minds always, which is, if we were put to the test, as our parents' and grandparents' generation was in America and in Britain, would we be able to live up to their example? And it should haunt everyone. This always haunts generations in Israel. But I can tell you with absolute certainty that that question has been answered by this generation. They have been weighed in the balance and been found to be magnificent. And just finally, I can tell you, when I see a 19-year-old girl helping with collecting the body parts and doing it because it's her job, when I see a young man who spent months in Gaza, when I see these people on the front line, always I think of this thing: what are your contemporaries like in America? And these young men and women show up their American and British counterparts to such an extent they should be embarrassed. I'll just leave you with this thought. These people, these young men and women, have seen things by the age of 20 that most Americans will not see by the time they're on their deathbed. But imagine the people this has created in Israel. It has created a generation of people who know what they're fighting for, who've stared right into the eyes of death and a death cult, and they are winning, and they are going to win.
While privileged 20-somethings have meltdowns over microaggressions, their Israeli peers collect body parts after Hamas attacks. When 19-year-old IDF soldiers clear booby-trapped tunnels, their Western counterparts demand trigger warnings for history classes. One generation faces death cults with courage. The other needs safe spaces from opposing viewpoints. These Israeli youth haven't just answered history's call, they've shamed an entire generation of keyboard warriors into irrelevance. They're not just surviving, they're showing what real courage looks like, while TikTok activists tremble over pronouns. So any thoughts on what Douglas and Senator Tom Cotton just discussed? Share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so that you never miss any of Douglas's debates.